Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I've prepared another omnibus-based list for all of you. Yes, we're going to be talking about 10 one-and-done comic book omnibus editions. A little while ago on my channel, I did 10 one-and-done comic collections. I thought I'd do a similar topic, but this time focusing only on omnibus editions. There might be a few instances of overlap, but in general, I tried to vary my choices this time. Before we dive in though, I just want to shout out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're looking to pick up your own comic book collected editions, I highly encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in this video's description, and if you see something you like, you can even use my discount code at checkout. The Comic Book Report, to save $2 off of your order. Please note if you use my affiliate code or link to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a fantastic way to support this channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with today's list. First on the list today, in no particular order, we have the Deadpool and Cable Omnibus by Fabian Nicieza from Marvel Comics. I did review this book on the channel a couple months ago, but I think it's a prime example of a great one-and-done series. So ironically enough, this Deadpool and Cable Omnibus collects issues of Cable and Deadpool. For the Omnibus edition, I guess they swapped the name order to cash in on Deadpool. Anyway, it collects all of that series run from Nicieza and team, and it is a great series. I first read this run years and years ago. I had the 3 kind of Ultimate Collection paperbacks before I was able to upgrade to this Omnibus edition, and honestly, it's just a great ride. Admittedly, I am an unapologetic fan of Deadpool, and Cable, well, this was frankly my first foray into exploring this mutant. I have since read Cable in other books, both before and after this was printed, but this was my first introduction to the character, so I didn't really have a grid for the character before it. In many ways, this Cable feels a little bit different than any I had ever experienced before, but I really loved what this brought to the table. We have a lot of warmth from his character overall, I would say, and a surprising amount of warmth from Deadpool as well. Yes, there are silly, zany antics, a lot of irreverent humor, but frankly, there is still a ton of heart to this series. There's some tearjerker moments, and honestly, I love the kind of buddy comedy action dynamic of this whole series in general. The Merc with a Mouth paired up with Cable, we have a lot of kind of mercenary mission type issues in this book. We have a lot of like shorter story arcs and a few overarching plot threads. I will say that I think the book is fairly well balanced between these 2 main characters, but overall I think that there's so much more than you would expect with a series like this contained within its pages. It's a wonderful book and you get a really good experience beginning, middle, and end, and by the time you finish the run you feel like you have a conclusive story and you really don't need to know all that much about these characters to enjoy this from the very start. Don't miss out on the Deadpool and Cable Omnibus. Okay, next up we're going to be doing the Silver Surfer Omnibus by Dan Slott, Mike, and Laura Allred. Yes, for longer time viewers of this channel, this is a favorite in the last year on my channel. This book really blew me away, which is surprising because the first time I read the first handful of issues, I wasn't immediately sold, so I can't really tell you why I actually upgraded and bought the Omnibus edition. I guess I wanted to give it a fair shot, and I do love the work from the Allreds. I love this art style, and honestly, I am a fan of a lot of Dan Slott's work that I've had the pleasure of reading. Well, at any rate, I did commit and I read this all the way through, and it has become one of my favorite comic runs of all time. This is a prime example of great one-and-done omnibus reading. I think that anyone can pick this off the shelf and really like what they read. And if not like it per se, because it might not be to their taste, I suppose, hopefully we can at least acknowledge that it's a good conclusive story, beginning, middle, and end. It has a really low barrier to entry. You don't need to know much about the Silver Surfer's mythos to enjoy this book, although knowing bits about his history do help, but I think that Dan Slott does a good job of filling in the details you need to understand the real conflict and kind of plot moments in his arc. Other than the gorgeous artwork and stylization we have here from the Allreds, I think what's really powerful for me about this book is that ultimately it is a love story. The Silver Surfer falls in love with a normal human girl, and honestly, their romance is really, really beautiful, as it really does span the galaxy. The storytelling is absolutely immersive and just enriching. I just felt so hopeful reading a lot of these issues. I think that the book overall is really well paced, and there's a lot of little mini adventures, even though you have one long kind of growing romance between the characters. It all just really works for me, and there's a really good definitive conclusion by the end of this volume that I think was really earned. A really great read. I can't wait to reread it again, but easily one of my prime examples for one and done omnibus reading. And hey, if you're still watching along and you have yet to subscribe to the channel, I'd just like to encourage you to do so. I'm always doing list videos like this, comic book reviews, hauls, unboxings, and more. Thank you so much for considering. Now on with the show. Next, we have the Grayson Super Spy Omnibus by Tim Seeley, Tom King, and Mikel Janin, brought to us by DC Comics. This is another book that I reviewed on the channel sometime last year, and wow, was this a fun, genre-bending piece of work. This is a great example for a one-and-done omnibus read, and honestly, it is one that really stands out. So for those that don't know, this is essentially Dick Grayson, the first Robin, yes, of Batman and Robin, who is then Nightwing. Anyway, this character has kind of fallen off the grid. In many circles, he's presumed dead, but we actually have him infiltrating a kind of clandestine, corrupt, kind of spy espionage organization, this international group known as Spiral. Anyway, it's a really fascinating read. He's kind of entrenched himself in this group at the behest of Batman to honestly try to topple it from the inside, but we basically have Dick Grayson become a full-on 007 James Bond-like spy. And yes, we still have some theatrics, some superheroics, some spandex, but honestly, this feels like a work of spy espionage thriller fiction much more than it feels like a superhero comic. And what I think is so compelling about this is it also still feels absolutely like the Dick Grayson we know and love. In my mind, this is really, really well crafted by both Seeley and King. It's a really compelling spy thriller, and honestly, it's beautifully realized by the incredible Mikel Janin, which is one of my favorite Batman artists in general. It's so cool to see him do this kind of spy genre. Really, really fun, and as a fan of both spy fiction like James Bond and Nightwing, Batman, Dick Grayson in general, this is really, really something else. It is another book that has a good definitive beginning, middle, and conclusion, and it's well paced throughout it. We also have him going on these little one-off adventures, even though there's some grand narratives of him trying to topple the organization and generally trying to find out these deeper rooted mysteries. Grayson is a book that many collectors may overlook, but I would urge you to reconsider. It's a fantastic one and done omnibus. Next on my list for great one-and-done omnibus editions, I'm gonna have to talk about Superman, the Death and Return of Superman Omnibus from DC Comics. At the time of the recording, this is the most updated edition they've published, and frankly, this is a monster collection. This book is absolutely packed out with great Superman goodies. For my money, this is one of the most defining moments in Superman's life, and honestly, I love having it all collected in this one epic tome. This not only collects the death of Superman's story arc at the beginning, but we have the kind of funeral for a friend, World Without Superman, and kind of reign of Superman's story arcs all included here. So it's a really, really large chunk of time in the DC universe. One of the great things about this book is it not only feels like a Superman book, but it feels much more than that. This is a DC comic book universe book, and what I mean by that is we not only have the titular death of Superman and the titular return of Superman in this book, we have everything in between, and we have not only what the Man of Steel accomplishes, but everything his absence means to those left behind, in Metropolis and in the DC universe in general. We have how his life and death impacts so many of the other heroes, supporting cast of characters, and you just see it ripple across, again, this comic book universe landscape. I really love this book. It feels very immersive and just all-encompassing, and I think for any DC comic fan out there, this is one that should definitely be in the library. Why I say this is a good one-and-done book as well is that we have the fantastic bookends in this book, of course being the death and return of Superman, and everything in between. You don't really need to have read too much before this to understand who Superman is and why this death matters, and you certainly don't need to read much after the return unless you really felt compelled or really liked this character. You could just read this one gigantic epic storyline or sequence of storylines in one go with this incredible omnibus and feel deeply satisfied at getting a real good chunk of Superman's history. Really like this book, absolutely a fun one. I'm so happy DC keeps releasing it. Next up, I have to give some love to the X-Men, and of course I'm going to be talking about Grant Morrison's new X-Men Omnibus. This was reprinted by Marvel Comics last year in 2023, and I absolutely capitalized on this reprint. I really enjoy the X-Men. For the longest time I had trouble jumping into their world, but I've kind of become a more well-versed X-Men fan. I'm still by no means an expert, but I'm definitely making my way around a lot of the catalog. Anyway, this was a really big glaring blind spot for me. I had read some of the early Morrison issues, really enjoyed it, loved that Frank Quietly art, but I had never committed to read the run in full. I think I had the first Ultimate Collection paperback back in the day, I think one of 3. Anyway, I sold it off, never got to read this collection, so when the reprint was announced, I knew that this was going to be a pre-order for me, so I was so eager to get this, and sure enough I did. Morrison for me has always been one of my absolute favorite comic book writers. The way Morrison approaches kind of the cerebral storytelling, mixing in some kind of punk feeling to it, it just always really works for me, and this is no exception. I think for me, the way Morrison completely re-engineered and refreshed our favorite merry band of mutants, it should absolutely be commended, and I really think it set the status quo or template for a lot of modern X-Men storytelling in so many ways. And this book has it all. This has Morrison's complete run on the title, New X-Men, and you can read it beginning, middle, and end with this one awesome omnibus. And for a franchise that's arguably notorious for breaking into or finding a good place to start, Morrison really does lay a good groundwork for those that want to jump onto the run. I really like this book. I think it covered tremendous ground for our favorite mutants, and it leads nicely into the astonishing X-Men era for Joss Whedon and John Cassaday, another fantastic run. But this book really does feel definitive. You feel like you have a good beginning, middle, and shocking resolution in many ways. I absolutely adore this book. I hope to revisit it in the future, and I think if you want something a little alternative or edgy still from your big 2, New X-Men might be a great place to start. Alrighty, keeping this ship moving forward, this is maybe my most divisive pick on the list, Fantastic Four by Matt Fraction, Mark Bagley, and Mike Allred Omnibus. This is kind of that Marvel Now era of Marvel Comics, and this run takes place directly after Jonathan Hickman's tenure on the book. This single omnibus includes both the Fantastic Four run by Matt Fraction as well as his FF run. That's the Future Foundation for those that are unaware. And these twin books kind of take place in parallel to each other. They're both written by Matt Fraction, but we have Fantastic Four mostly illustrated by Mark Bagley, a name you might recognize from Spider-Man comics, Ultimate Spider-Man, things like that. And then we have the FF issues that are illustrated by Mike Allred. If you don't know much about these artists, even as I flip through this book, you'll see that they're a very, very different kind of design sensibility, and I loved that. Coming from a singular voice of Matt Fraction, it was fascinating to see how these two titles differed from each other, those being Fantastic Four and FF respectively. Basically, this is a great one-and-done omnibus for me because the first couple issues set a just general premise, which is that Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, finds out that he is sick and his body is degrading, and he believes this affects the rest of his fantastic family. He comes under the pretense of wanting to go on a family vacation for a year, going to all manner of time and space and beyond, and his idea is that this is going to take about a year, but he'll come back to this exact time and space. And even so, while he's gone, he wants to make sure the world is defended and has its own Fantastic Four. He wants to make sure the Future Foundation, which is essentially the bright leading kids of the future that the Fantastic Four kind of shepherd, he wants to make sure that that student group is also taken care of as well. So each of the Fantastic Four members essentially deputize a replacement, and they leave them in charge while they're away, which is again only supposed to be a moment, but things go awry. And we have the book following Fantastic Four and the FF with this kind of step in, understudy Fantastic Four. It's just such a compelling and fun, entertaining read that I think a lot of comic fans overlook. A great story beginning, middle, and end, and a ton of variety here. Definitely recommend this omnibus. Next on our list, another Marvel omnibus for all of you, the Venom by Donny Cates and Ryan Stegman omnibus, or Venomnibus for those that like to have a bit of fun with that. This is the entire Cates-Stegman era on Venom, and I really, really loved it. We have a couple one-shots thrown in here. We have the complete Absolute Carnage little miniseries and the complete King in Black miniseries. This book, in many ways, is such a triumph. This is a book that was really, really hugely recommended by almost everyone I went went to, and I was not exactly dragging my heels, but it took me a while to finally just give in and buy this book. But wow, am I so happy I did. This is easily one of my favorite omnibus reads in recent memory, personally. And it's just riveting, engaging storytelling. I think that this makes everyone a fan of Eddie Brock who can really sit with this book and read it cover to cover. It makes him so much more empathetic and interesting and compelling. Cates really builds out the lore of not only Eddie Brock and Venom, but the symbiotes in general. Frankly, it's just fascinating to me that this started as a costume for Spider-Man, and now we have this deeply, deeply nuanced lore for this whole alien race and creature. Just amazing to me. The art throughout from Stegman and others is just really just grotesque, visceral, and beautiful to behold. For a book that looks kind of edgy and grimdark, there is so much optimism, hope, and heart in this. There's so many great messages about being in this together, community, finding strength, and just beauty through brokenness and healing. And I just really, really loved it. This was such a great read. One of the things that Cates does in this that I believe make it a great one-and-done series is that he establishes this kind of ticking clock dynamic in the first story arc, where basically the creator of the symbiotes has been slumbering, but he wants to be awoken and basically take over Earth. And you have that set up in that first arc, and then from there, you're kind of just waiting for the ball to drop. You're waiting for this creature to come back and wreak havoc. And ultimately, that's kind of sort of what happens by the conclusion of this book. Without going into many spoilers, from end to end in this book, we have just one gigantic story arc with a couple little ones thrown in there for good measure. But they establish it early on and set the expectations high. A really, really great read with a fantastic payoff. Next on our list today, we're going to be jumping back over to DC with the Planetary Omnibus by Warren Ellis and John Cassaday. And I say this is released by DC Comics, but initially this was a Wildstorm book, I believe. Anyway, this is a fantastic series and one of my go-to examples as a one-and-done comic book omnibus. So for those that don't know, Planetary is about this, let's call it an interdimensional, multiversal, kind of just all-encompassing peacekeeping force that tries to stop threats to existence and so many other things. This is a really, really interesting group of characters that have varying abilities and backstory, but basically this team is tasked with all of these little assignments, and as we go, we kind of have more central mysteries to unravel. We have things that kind of challenge the nature of the universe and what is going to save the world. And I just really loved it. I know I'm speaking kind of vague and generally because I really don't want to spoil any of this for anyone who's interested in a good kind of science fiction, mystery, action series. This is really it for you. Some great psychological work going on here, a good amount of character-driven storytelling, and honestly, it is beautiful artwork from Cassaday. I'm a big fan. Another thing this series does that I just adore as a fan of literature in general is that this book really pays homage to so many different types of genres or greater subgenres in fiction. Like we have one issue that's going to be all about kind of kaiju drama, kind of like Godzilla, giant monster kind of stuff. The next issue will be kind of a Japanese ghost story, detective noir. The next issue is going to be a straight-laced kind of Silver Age of comic books, kind of pastiche. It's just really, really gripping and interesting, and I really love, clearly Ellis and Cassaday are just lovers of fiction, and honestly this book has so much of that on display here. I think for any literary fans here in the watching audience, this is a book to read. This is the book to recommend. Definitely don't miss out on Planetary. It really has something to give, and wow, is it a good read, one and done. Okay, next we have the Gwenpool Omnibus from Marvel Comics. And maybe I take back what I said about the Fantastic Four Omnibus earlier in this video. This could be my most divisive pick. Yes, I know that this might be an interesting choice for those that have never read Gwenpool, but really, this is a fantastic book that has a good beginning, middle, and end. I know, how many times can I say that phrase in this video? But honestly, when I'm talking about one-and-done comic book collections, it's so important to have a really good story structure like that things feel very closed, definitive, and complete. And I honestly felt that reading Gwenpool. From her fascinating origins on a variant cover to her appearances in Howard the Duck and beyond into one-shots and ultimately her own ongoing series before jumping over to, was it West Coast Avengers? Honestly, the character of Gwenpool has had a very, very fascinating ride in her relatively short comic book history. For those that don't know, Gwenpool has really nothing to do with either Gwen Stacy of the Spider-Man mythos or Deadpool. No, her name is actually Gwendolyn Poole, and she is presumably from our world, a world where Marvel Comics are just that, a comic book universe. A universe, in fact, that she is a huge fan of. Or at least she is in the time where she actually falls into the Marvel universe herself. And in so doing, she kind of becomes a zany character, almost like someone who's playing kind of a Grand Theft Auto-like video game. You're in this sandbox in this world that has no real consequence for you because you know it's a fictional landscape. And yet she starts to become very gripped by the characters. She starts to feel the realness of all the characters in this universe she's fallen into. And that's really where the heart of Gwenpool shines. We have a character that is really deeply empathetic and emotional. And there's a surprising amount of heart and just depth to this run. When you finish that main Gwenpool comic book run within the pages of this omnibus, honestly, it's hard not to be deeply satisfied. I think that this book has a lot of just zany energy for people that are looking for something a little bit off the beaten path. People that like exploration of fourth wall breaking and kind of meta-narrative in a way that doesn't feel as obnoxious as it probably looks, I definitely recommend Gwenpool. It's a really great book, and I think a lot of people are overlooking it. And finally, last but certainly not least, on our list of great one-and-done comic book omnibus editions, we're going to be talking about DC Comics' Infinite Crisis Omnibus. Now, this was an omnibus I also read last year, and it really left a mark on me. Infinite Crisis has always been my favorite DC comic event of all time, at least that I've had the pleasure of reading thus far. But up until last year, I had never read all of the tie-ins that went into this marvelous event over at DC. So this omnibus includes all of the kind of prelude, tie-in miniseries that all surround the Infinite Crisis event. Everything kind of serves as a lead-in, and honestly, Infinite Crisis happens toward the end of this book as a kind of ultimate culmination of all of these different miniseries. And while yes, this can be considered a sequel of sorts to the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it really does sit on the shoulders of a lot of ongoing DC storytelling that occurred before this era, I do think that this is still a fantastic example of a one-and-done kind of omnibus. And why I say that, this is my justification, is that I think of this as just one gigantic event omnibus. Think about a comic book event. The good ones usually have a good beginning and a good conclusion and some nice meat in the middle, and that is what Infinite Crisis already gives you. But what this omnibus gives is all of the supplemental material, all the sinews and tendons that kind of keep everything together. I had read Infinite Crisis by itself before, but reading it in context of all of these preludes and miniseries in this book, the scope of Infinite Crisis is just a grand scale epic. This is my favorite complete event I had ever read, and like I mentioned in the Superman Omnibus earlier in this video, this is a perfect example of a DC Universe book. We just bring the whole universe forward, and we get to see the DC comic landscape from so many different perspectives. This book feels full, it feels satisfying, and it has just a ripping good conclusion. Yes, the DC Universe continues on after this, but this is such a good example of a standalone omnibus hit. Okay, and that's going to wrap up our list today for 10 one-and-done comic book omnibus editions. I don't know about you, but the time just flew by making this video for me. I hope it felt that way watching it. I hope I didn't bore you too much. Honestly, this was so much fun. Omnibus format has been one of my favorite ways to collect these books when I have the opportunity to, and revisiting so many of these for this video, it was just a personal blast for me. But I'm sure I've missed out on a lot of great other one-and-done, singular story kind of comic book omnibuses out there, and that's where you come in. If you're still watching, please comment some of your favorite omnibus editions that feel like they tell a full story. I'd love to get your recommendations below. There's always a chance I haven't read what are some of your favorites, and I'm always looking for a great recommendation. And even if I've read them, maybe there's people watching that are just looking for more recommendations than I provided in this video. Please, please, please continue to comment, engage in discussion. This community is so wonderful, and I am thankful for each and every one of you. And with that, until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, share this video with a friend, and maybe check out another on your way out. Thanks so much, and have a good one.